Now, we're finally going to get to the winterizing. Those who are in the beginner course, you may have already seen this graph, the beekeeper's dream. You're going to buy that package. It's going to build up, and you're going to have peak population right when the blackberries are in full bloom, and they'll continue on but taper down and not eat up all the stores like the Californians do. The population will taper down. There will be some knotweed flow here, fireweed, knotweed, okay. And then you'll have like maybe 20,000 going into the winter, but not too big because they eat more if they're too big. Okay, hive management ideal. I thought we better conceptualize a little on this winter thing. On the left-hand side, this is the annual cycle of the honeybee colony. Again, you're looking for this peak. And this is for Virginia, but Virginia's kind of close to us. They're only about, I put it over on the side. I put the latitude. If you remember your latitude rings that kind of go around, imaginary rings around the globe, and they tell you how far north you or south you are. 90 is the North Pole, 0 is the equator. It's just interesting that we sometimes don't realize that we are farther north or farther south. For example, I will often talk about the University of Guelph. They have some really good videos. They have a good one on how to light a smoker, how to set up a nuke. And they have like 20 of these, and they're little bite-sized digestible pieces on beekeeping. There's a whole set. Paul Kelly, I'll mention him. He's the one with the smoker. He's worked years at the University of Guelph in Ontario. Well, you'd think that's way far north of us. No, it's south. And so in some ways, their weather isn't that far off ours. Yes, they get more snow probably, but they are close to, I think, the lakes. I have to literally look that up. But sometimes remembering the latitude, if Snohomish is at latitude 47, Virginia is only at 37. I'm pulling off these I'm rounding off over here. And quite often people will give you advice. Randy Oliver, I know, people say, well, he's in the same zone as us. Not really. Look over at those hours of daylight, and you'll see the difference between, okay, is this Virginia here? I'm really bad. Yes, that's Virginia. Okay. And then University of Guelph somewhere up here. And then Randy Oliver is somewhere here, I guess. Almost Nevada, I think. It's like here. But we are up here, and that is quite a difference in day length, in the way the sun strikes us and such. So this curve will shift some with that. I'm kind of sidetracking, but sometimes when you're watching on YouTube, it helps to stop and say, how far north or south are they? But what really makes the difference, I think, is that like Virginia and North Carolina, we get a lot of YouTube videos from the southern areas and from up the East Coast. And the East Coast has the Gulf Stream coming up from Florida, coming all the way up. We have this wonderfully cold maritime and Arctic type breezes coming down, and our ocean currents come down. So that's more of an apprentice type topic, but I thought I'd mention it. Fall. We are already in fall. I mean, that sounds really weird, but to a beekeeper, this is really fall, even though we hardly got into summer. So we're talking the knotweed flow. We're looking at, okay, are they going to have enough stores? How's the pollen looking? I was surprised. A lot of the hives I've been looking at, including my own, weren't heavy on pollen. They're finally coming up a little bit, but that might be because I fed them some pollen stuff, because they were totally out. There was no bee bread ring around any of the brood. We're actually cutting back on brood. It's time to think about combining meat colonies. If you wait a month to do it, it's a stress on the bees right before we go into winter. If you think you need to requeen, this is really when you do it. Give her time to settle in. Make sure she works. A caged queen and queens in superstructure in packages and nukes, there's a 25% failure rate. Just accept it. It's the way, and that's a whole big long talk. There's a guy named David Tarpey, T-A-R-P-Y, and he does all kinds of videos. He's studying it on why the queens are failing so early. And why are we getting so many poor quality queens? And he suspects a number of things. It isn't just the miticides and the pesticides. It's also shipping problems. If you get too hot or cold in shipping, if they're shipped a little earlier to kind of cut down the profit margin, you know, if you ship the queen who's 14 days past emergence, and you can see that she's laying, and they're supposed to check that, and you stick her in a cage, she didn't get to lay a little while longer. Queens who get to lay a full month before they're put in the cage do better. They know that. But it's a profit margin thing. I got to get that next group of queens out of them, got to make money. So the queen shippers are part of the problem. We are talking about, okay, we're hefting our hives. We're going, are we going to need feed? Or we're still waiting for that knotweed, and it should be coming in. My buds were tight like a week and a half ago, and I've got to get back there and see. Pat has great fireweed. I just totally green with envy because Pat's fireweed. I couldn't believe how much she has out there. Okay, and the mite counts. Hopefully you've already done that. And this one is the easy one. I do like this. It has a measuring line inside. I did Varroa last time, so I won't bore the people who came last time, okay? Because I already talked for an entire class on that. But I'm assuming people will talk about anything you want to after I get done with my rush through. So you might have been kind of monitoring, but this isn't really a treatment. When you scoop your capping fork in to those drone, when this gets full of drone brood, and you scoop out your drones, and I can explain that better later if people want me to. You're looking because a drone brood attracts the female mites more strongly than regular brood. And so here's a poor drone that's been cut down in his prime, speared and pulled out. Okay. But it happens naturally too. When you're opening up your hives and you're separating the hive boxes and there's that bird comb, it's often drone combs. So when you're pulling it apart, take a peek and look to see if there's anything crawling and moving on your drones that shouldn't be. You often won't see anything in the spring, but if you just kind of keep an eye on it, it doesn't hurt to know what's going on in your hive. We did Varroa treatments last time. This should be on the page under files, in the group discussion page. Now, the actual nuts and bolts of winterization. You will hear beekeepers again and again say, cold alone doesn't kill. The three things that kill are the cluster's too small. You have a weak or small colony. And it could have been a late swarm or split. It could have been that the yellow jackets, WHYHW, yellow jackets, hornets, wasps, came and robbed it out. It could be the Varroa. They just are weakened. Often they stop raising the brood when they're that weak. They could be actually starving. We have our summer dearth. It depends on where you are. Those people with lots of fireweed, for example, don't have a dearth right now. Those of us who don't have really good, don't have something that's really, really good, tend to go into dearth. But I do get knotweed. My bees will fly a mile to get to it. And condensation is the third killer. It's not just the moisture in the hive. Bees are tropical. They like high humidity, 50 to 80% greenhousing type humidity. Ugh. But they're okay with that. But wet, cold water that drips on them, especially when they're in cluster and they can't move. We'll go into cluster about why they don't move. Why don't you just move over if the faucet's dripping on your head? Well, they can't. And if you took beginner, you remember my tent analogy for how that condensation builds up. That when the person you're camping with, it's just that you seal everything up. Oh, we're going to be too cold. And they make you seal up even the top vents. And you wake up in the morning and everything's wet. The whole sides, the walls are all wet. Stuff is dripping on you down from the inside holes. There's so much condensation from just what you breathed out. Your respiration. All night long, 24/7 for a beehive. So that moisture has to be dealt with, and it can't be allowed to turn into condensation. And you always have to autopsy your dead outs. You really have to do your best. Take smartphone pictures, and that's where BeeBuddy, talk it through, try to figure out what went wrong. But hopefully nothing will go wrong because you're going to do all this right? Okay. the guidelines for the stores, that's the biggest thing. So we always end up talking about feed, and I'm sorry for those of you who just took this in beginner, but ideally, you will have, okay, 2 10-frame deeps, or you will have 3 8-frame deeps, or 3 8-frame, or 3 10-frame westerns. Top bar gets a little tricky. It's going to have to be at least that equivalent. So you're looking pretty much at the 20 frames, depending on how deep and how wide your top bar is. They vary a little bit on how big the frame is when the bees build it out. And again, you need them to build out all the way to count it as a full frame. So half bees and brood, half stores. 100 to 120 pounds, including the woodenware. And the reason people say that is it's often hefting, using a luggage scale. Some people, if you really feel like you need to know, is it there, you can stand, if you've got the muscle, put the bathroom scale on the plywood and stand on. I've done that just to satisfy my own curiosity. If you have any doubt, I really recommend you just leave the honey in there. Better to have the excess stores in the spring than have a dead out. Better to feed them so they have extra honey syrup. It's just, you know, sugar syrup honey is not the most nutritious, but it is better for them than dry feed. And consider a spring honey harvest. There are people who do this on purpose. They wait to see if they want it. The bees take care of it. A few types of honey will granulate on you, and I should put a picture. Karen Perro, who took this class, I think the last time, she had ivy honey that granulated on her, turned into white sugar right in the combs. So she's going to watch now. She said she gets a pretty good ivy honey harvest because of some hillsides that are right behind her. And so she's going to pull that honey off next time because it's just going to granulate. And it's hard for the bees to get to. Technically they can, but they'll eat anything else first. Now I gave you this 100, 120 because new beekeepers have to have some math. Really, you need those figures. You need the comfort of having something that seems definite while we're saying, it's your best judgment, you know, well, you sort of, and yeah, and 2 people tell you different things. One thing you do have to understand is more stores are used in a warm winter than a cold. And I put in a few graphs later on about the cluster and the way the bees break up the cluster and then reform the cluster. And my personal tragedy was 2019. The snow fell and then stayed on the ground for 5 weeks, which never happens in this area. Snow on the ground for 5 weeks? Okay, and it was sunny too, and it reflected light up. And I had one hive that got fooled, and I never checked. I knew that that was a strong hive. I knew it didn't have mites. I knew it had plenty of food. And those silly bees, those Italifornians, they got so much Italian blood in them, I guess. They like big families, and they took every lick of honey or pollen they had. They cleaned the hive and raised brood. They thought that spring was around the corner. The daylight fooled them, which I guess I should have. I should have at least cracked the inner cover and seen what they were up to. I didn't think to do that, and I should have checked the feed, but I was so sure they were okay. Well, they weren't. There's a financial consideration about taking the honey off. If you do, and you know they need the sugar back, you have to do it. Some people say, oh, I can't take away their honey. And other people go, $100, $1.50 an ounce for honey, and 50 cents a pound for sugar. Well, there's practical economics, so you decide. Banked honey is the best spring feed with one exception, which I actually ran into. If you've had an outbreak of nosema while that comb was on the hive, or an outbreak of something funny looking in your brood, it won't hurt you to eat the honey. Nosema and whatever brood disease it is won't hurt you at all. But if you do feed that back to them, especially in the spring, you're going to be hitting them with the same disease that they're susceptible to. And I actually accidentally didn't recognize that I didn't have a strong brood problem, but I had a small brood problem. And they did pull out of it, but I didn't help them out by feeding them back the honey. It's the one time. So watch for nosema, bee diarrhea, basically. Well, it's closely correlated with bee diarrhea. Blots all over your hive, inside or out. And the brood looks funny. In that case, just take the honey for yourself, feed them back, save sugar. And sugar, table sugar is plant sugar. Sucrose, that's table sugar, is plant sugar. That's why it's so good for the bees. It's what they would pick up if they went out to collect nectar. It's the largest percentage of the sugar in the nectar is sucrose, like your table sugar. And that's why it comes from cane, sugar cane, and from bees, is it is plant sugar. So individual colonies and strains, you could have two hives side by side like that one. I forget how many hives I had that year, but it was the only one that had that problem of deciding to raise the brood. And even if it had lived the next winter, I could have watched it, but if the queen changed, maybe it swarmed by disc split or something, or there was a supersedure, the strain changes. All the bees are mutts, and sometimes it's very difficult to predict what their characteristics are going to be. So don't assume, do the 5-second check and save your hive. Beginners, if you've been to the beginner class, you've already heard this. Watch out, it's nature's calendar. And boy, did that happen this spring with the pouring rain. There's weeks, a week at a time of rain, maybe a sunbreak, another week of rain. But I think that the fall is even harder to predict than our spring. At least in our spring, we know that eventually it's going to get better. We just have to keep feeding them if they can't fly out of the hive and get any nectar or any pollen. But right now, okay, it's the middle of August. We're having our hottest temperatures of the year. But actually, it's not that hot. It's raining. And I'm wondering what September's going to look like. Is it going to be a cool, rainy September, and they can't really go out to forage very much? And in some ways, that's good. I think they start realizing, oh, winter's coming. Or will it be a false summer where it looks beautifully sunny and the bees stay active and they keep trying to forage, even if there's nothing to forage? They keep, the foragers go out and they keep trying, and they use up all their stores, and they keep raising brood because they can't see winter coming. I think we're at a disadvantage in that we don't have definite seasons on this side of the mountains. I think it makes a difference. Anybody finds a good researcher who says it better, let me know. It's one of those questions. I really think the bees have troubles. We have to be watching and helping them out. October, usually cool and rainy, but I've seen it bright sunny while it was cool. And again, the foragers are out trying to fly. They're trying to raise brood. They're confused, and they may use up their stores. Even if you had 120 pounds of hive at the end of August, beginning of September, by the end of October, if you think something's funny and they're flying too much, I'd keep feeding them. There's only been 1 year where I fed them basically well into October. I said, I don't understand what's going on, but I kept the liquid feed because it was that warm. Critical questions, let's see. Okay, so you're trying to figure out when the foraging weather, when their active storage using weather is going to end. Knotweed, that's the important one. I got a picture coming up for anyone that does not visualize what knotweed is, because quite often we talk about it for an entire beekeeping meeting, and then somebody says, what's knotweed? It is just absolutely critical as our last big flow for many people in the riparian zones, in the marshy riverside areas. Here's the knotweed. It goes up to like 8 feet tall, and it is the only noxious weed that the Noxious Weed Board in the state of Washington wants to get rid of. And we wish they would stop getting rid of it because it's our fall honey flow. And it's this really dark, rich honey that some people go, ew, and other people go, wow. Sort of, I'd say almost like molasses. And it's important as to whether bees get an opportunity for cleansing flights. It helps keep their gut fauna, meaning they don't get bee diarrhea. It keeps their flora and fauna in their bee gut on an even level, the way it's supposed to be. And those winter stores, and make notes on all this for your journal, your hive log. And if you stop and look at it, sometimes visually people can stop and look at it and go, oh yeah, you're right. And I'm not sure how accurate this is. I'm working on this. If anybody else would like to take a better look at it, this easily shifts. I think these shift over, like knotweed, mine might finally be opening up. In other places, it opened up at the beginning of August. So this slides like a month each way, but you do notice we basically start running out of options about here. There really isn't much, even if it's sunny. Most of the native vegetation bloomed back. If you go back here and look at the natives, this is, again, there's at least a version of this, a fairly current version of this pollen and nectar source table. There are a number of people who tried to do one of these. I tried to redo it, and I think maybe every person has to look at it and do some adjustments yourself. Some people are nowhere near the Japanese knotweed. I didn't even know there wasn't such a thing as goldenrod in this area. I finally found some. Basically, it's not at my elevation, but I've got a lot of tansy ragwort, whether I want it or not. So you might take a look at this, might make your own in your hive logs. So as much as it seems silly to be talking about food so much, it is one of the things you can do. The manual explains how to take it's not really a fish scale, it's really a luggage scale, and try hefting your hive that way. I've always just looked down into the hive and then tilted. I tilt my hive bodies to see underneath, hefted, counted the frames, and done it that way, full or not full. But there are like this list here. I could put this list on if it would help anybody. I think the weights on this list below sort of look like bees and brood, because honey can get heavier than that. So I don't know if that's supposed to be mixed, sort of. But I pulled this out of one place because I thought it at least gives you an idea. If you're using deeps or mediums, 8 frames or 10 frames, keep track. Liquid is the better. Honey from the healthy hive or your bank, and you can bank honey in your freezer because it doesn't granulate as long as you freeze it. It likes to granulate at about, most honey's at about 55 and such. So you got to keep them warm, like at room temperature up in your kitchen upper shelf. Or if you put them out in your nice cool pantry and you think the honey would last longer, usually granulates on you, right? And then you feed 2 to 1 after you've given them whatever honey you are going to give them, or let them keep. And if you're unsure, I say just feed it. Sugar is so cheap. It's kind of bad for our figures, isn't it? I mean, for our nutrition. Sugar is so cheap in this country, it's ridiculous. And you feed until the daytime temps are below 55 degrees. Syrup isn't going to flow at below 50 degrees. If you've got it covered, and I'll show later how you have the insulation on top of your liquid feeder, you can probably go to 50 degrees. Just wait until they stop taking it. If you're using jar feeders, that's really easy. You can just see that they've stopped taking it. If you don't, then you got to watch the temperature more. And a lot of times it gets so cool at night and just barely in the low 50s during the day, and then it's back down to low 40s at night. Actually, the syrup is having trouble keeping warm and flowing. Dry. You can serve, it's considered dry, whether it's granulated, sprinkled, you know, totally like you serve it out of your sugar shaker, a fondant, an icing type, or a brick, a sugar block. And I go ahead and feed pollen subpatties quite often. Some people say back off on those if they have a lot of brood, so they won't keep building brood. But I don't know. I can't control my Californians. Some of them know how to limit their families and some don't. And I just, okay, sometimes you just do your best. That is one of the reasons people talk about differences with Carniolans and Caucasians. Be more careful about their stores, in that they will sometimes cut back their brood correctly. They'll come down on that curve, that population curve, that you're hoping that they will naturally control themselves. And then, but then the same ones that brood down for the winter, sometimes in the spring, need a little extra boost to get going because they're slow to start up. And you need them up and running by the blackberry flow. I mean, honey's not the only reason we keep bees, but we sure could use the help financially, and our bees could use the stores. So if you've been in the beginner class, you've already heard this, when do you feed? There's all these reasons. We just went through summer dearth. it's time probably to switch to the 2-to-1. You sometimes feed 1-to-1 in summer dearth because, or partly because they need the water if it gets really hot, especially on the other side of the mountains. And the liquid there, see, 50 degrees, if it's fully covered and the liquid is actually staying at 50 degrees. But you got to switch over to the solid if it goes any lower or they stop taking it. When you feed, it is best not to feed stop and start. And there's actually a research paper on that. I keep looking for something that backs up something that everyone says or that I just know is true. And you probably feel the same way. I can know something's true, but I can't always find a backup. Okay, and we're past the blackberry flow. Some of these slides I obviously stole, and I just finished putting them together right before we started. To feed or not to feed, I use the Wall Street test. You risk as much as you can sleep at nights risking. If you feel like your hive is going to make it and you can sleep at nights, don't worry. But it's cheap insurance if you decide to just feed anyway. And so they make a little extra sugar syrup honey, and they have it in the spring. Right there in the hive, already warmed up and insulating their hive. I like jar feeders. Those jar feeders, they are a hassle. A commercial beekeeper wouldn't use them. But for small scale, or when you have nukes, or when you're monitoring certain hives closely, the uptake or downtake, I guess you'd say, the level of the in the jar tells you what's going on. Tells you if they're taking it. If they're not taking it, better go inside and check, even though you weren't going to, because you were trying to let that queen mate or whatever. You were trying not to disturb them. Preventing nutritional stress really does prevent disease. You heard this from your mom. Eat your veggies, you know, but it's the same. It really is true. For bees, they get less stressed. And then the new hives, you're past that. We see what's going on. And sometimes feeding, if your hives are side by side and you're pretty much in dearth, reduce those entrances down. But if you have any doubts, you might end up feeding the colony neighbors, because it will help prevent the bees from just going around to the next hive and trying to rob, go get a free meal, takeout. Limiting feed is an important commercial strategy, but for backyard, smaller scale beekeepers, think twice before you limit on purpose. It just sometimes backfires. Carl Kreilschein, there is on the top line. Feed continuously, stop and start feeding stresses the bees, and he did this really neat experiment decades ago. This is something that's been known for a long time. And I often warn people, you start and stop feed. One of the things that bees do that doesn't make sense to us because we think anthropomorphically, we think like people, and we think emotionally. Bees are very practical. They are little efficiency experts. If a bee decides that for the good of the hive, we need to cut back on feeding, we don't have the stores. They are very logical. They look at the entire hive population and they say, we can't raise those eggs. They follow the queen and they eat the eggs behind her. She doesn't necessarily cut back on laying, they cut back on raising. Okay, maybe that's not too serious, but we're in a July dearth and they don't have enough coming in. Next, they start eating the youngest larvae that hatched. They're not going to feed them. They have to keep the foragers going or the hive would collapse. They have to keep the queen going. The adults are more important. And this continues on until in a really bad July dearth, you open up the hive and all you see is cat brood. And the next time you come in, you don't even see the cat brood. They won't let the queen's eggs grow up at all. So watch for that in July. And that is often when people say, do I have a queen? I see no eggs, no young larvae, no uncapped larvae, and the capped larvae that's there is emerging. It's that old. So she hasn't laid in almost 21 days. And it can simply be they're in dearth. Look at, do they have any pollen stores? Do they have the bee bread ring around the brood? And you should already have finished that. But it may mean that your stores are really low, including pollen, which is one of the reasons why I'd say go ahead and feed some pollen sub now. I don't know if they can really store it, but at least they won't have to dip into any real pollen they've got stored if they can use that. All the bees need pollen, not just the young larvae. You kind of get that impression, but actually everybody needs protein, vitamins, lipids. We all need it. And nutritional stress reduced is a disease prevention strategy. It is a BMP, a best management practice. I think they stole that from MBAs or something. It sounds so technical when we say that as beekeepers. Yes, I practice my BMPs. I'm sorry, I'm a little overtired. I'm kind of giddy here. Okay, when you feed, do use entrance reducers or robbing screens, and you're watching for the yellow jackets. The smell of that hive is already starting to pull them in, and I'd love to hear, especially at the end of this, are you seeing the yellow jackets? Last year, you took your lid off the hive and they just died for it. You couldn't smash them as fast as they were coming in when you were trying to check your hive. So far, so good this year. But last year there was something that happened, and it was free-for-alls. Luckily, I didn't get anything robbed out because I reduced entrances. I got so I didn't even check my hives for a couple of weeks there. And it doesn't stop right away because wasps and such, like bumblebees, can fly at about 10 degrees lower temperature than honeybees. You'll see a few honeybees straggling out there. But bumblebees are better pollinators for a number of things because they will do those extra hours of pollination in the morning and in the evening. And yellow jackets, that gives them that many more chances to sneak in past the guards who might have kind of pulled back from the entrance because it's cold and nobody's going in or out. And so they're actually a higher risk. Ann Harmon did some wonderful talks on sugar presentation. HMF, I don't know if anybody wants me to really explain what hydroxymethylfuranose. It is a degradation product of fructose, basically. And it forms if certain cornstarch is where you really find it, and cornstarch that has been made, high fructose cornstarch that you hear about, it's so bad, oh, it's so bad for you. Well, it's really bad for bees if it's been made with the acid hydrolysis method. And there's another method called the enzymatic. When you buy cornstarch, it's not labeled. Corn syrup. When you buy corn syrup, it's not labeled which way it was made, and it's not labeled how it was stored. The acidity with heat and with time, any one or two or all three of those makes HMF, which is very toxic to bees. It would be toxic to people too, but we just aren't that dependent on sugar in our diet, no matter how much we seem to eat or like it. But with bees, it is very toxic. When you go to make candy blocks and stuff, I put this probably in the wrong place, but a tablespoon of water per pound of granulated white sugar. It's such an easy recipe. And that's from Rusty Burlew. I always recommend her honeybeesweet.com when you want to quick check something. She knows how to run a website, and you enter it in your search term in, and you'll often get right to what you want. Something like you want sugar recipes, feed recipes. A lot of you have already decided what kind of feeder to get. One of the reasons for doing the winterization talk now is in case you haven't decided or you're going to try a new one, this you may have to order, especially, I think Man Lake has finally got its act together. Somebody said that they finally got the catalog that they ordered like over a month ago. So hopefully they're catching up. They got the supply chains working again. But if not, don't wait too long. And inline, you remember these from if you took a beginning beekeeper, you remember that. It's always possible to use a Ziploc, and that's kind of that can change the height. It can be a very low profile, depending on what your system is of how you're going to put the feeders inside, which is the best. And if you're going to do it outside, this is wrong. This should have an entrance reducer right here, so it's not easy for robbers to sneak right in and around the corner. Make it hard. Leave an inch over here if you're really going to do a board bin. Or even better, put the board bin inside. Flat, low-profile feeder that works with top bars that have peaked roofs. I put it in because Frederick Dunn was the one that showed it on his. He's one of the people I recommend for a good YouTube video blog. Once a week, and he answers questions and such too. Oh, this I don't understand. Why WASPA put this in the beginner manual, I don't understand. You never put these directly on the frames. Because if you forget, especially in the springtime, they'll start building from up above. There's no ceiling here. There's no reason they wouldn't build comb from whatever lid you have up above. And that actually happened to someone. And it was, it was horrific. But they showed us this, but it isn't true. Don't do that. When you're picking your feeder, you're going to be thinking about, how do I get to it to refill it without completely removing the inner cover and disturbing the bees? Because we don't just drop in temperature. We can hover there at that like 55, where you could be feeding them liquid feed during the daytime, still 55, for quite a while. So you want to have something that you can easily get to. Okay, I've drummed it. I think I've said enough. I am repeating myself somewhat. Solid is really only an emergency food. Sometimes I don't hear people recognize that. It doesn't insulate. The bees aren't right next to it. It's not right alongside of them when they're in cluster. They have to come up and get it. So things have to be warm enough, and they have to be mobile enough that they can come up and get it, and mix it with water. So probably there's some condensation on the side of their hives. You don't want no condensation. You just don't want condensation dripping on your cluster. So here's some methods where this you do often put directly on the frames, and use either another hive body, which is really too deep. This looks like a Western. That's a lot of airspace in there. But some kind of shim or spacer, and I think here's an emery shim, sometimes called a honey shim. And that's not really the only reason, the only thing you use this for. This is actually, see that little notch there? This narrow shim, people often put it on top of their honey supers to give the bees a second entrance to come in, and the foragers can go in, quick drop off of the whatever they're carrying, the honey to the receiver bees, or they take their pollen pellets and pack them into the pollen cells. If they can do that, coming in quickly through this top, instead of coming through the main entrance all the way up through the brood chambers, working their way up, it makes more sense. It does seem like you would probably get a little bit better honey production. So this is called an emery or a honey shim, and this was actually how to do it, not the plans. But a shim is often, here's another one. Sometimes it's called a rim too. And sometimes I like to put 1/8 inch screen stapled on underneath to hold whatever I've got in there. We're going to talk about moisture absorbency in a minute, and styrofoam too, and stapled burlap too. I've got a picture of that coming up. But before we leave feeders, make sure that you are happy with the kind you picked. You're going to try a new one this year, I would order it before anything can go wrong with the supply chains. And sugar. Actually would not wait until the last minute to get sugar because it was so crazy in the spring. People were running out, and they were saying, don't hoard. I'm going, I'm a beekeeper, and it's pouring rain all the way into June. I need the sugar. No, not me. I'm not. It's my bees. Okay. It's like when you go in, well, you probably don't do that kind of treatment, but if you use alcohol and you're actually using ethanol and beekeeping, and you're trying to explain, I need the full thing of vodka. Yeah, right. Little ladies, we know. They don't believe me. But that's okay. It's for my bees. It really is. Okay, accessible. So make sure that you're going to be able to monitor it in the weather that you're going to have without chilling the brood. I really recommend internal if you can possibly do it versus the external. But don't cover up your ventilation. You want that airflow going through. If you can get a 3/8 inch gap between the bars of the top bar and above the top bar if you can too. If not, at least something where you put it right on the top bars, right on the tops of the frame. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading that wrong. It's my own writing. Top bars, if you put the feeder on top, you got to give them a gap to get up and down. So you're going to have to move the bars of the top bar apart. Okay. I've been trying to put notes in about top bars because people are really fascinated with top bars, and they are a little bit different. Early in the spring, can be January, you will suddenly have increased humidity and need for ventilation. Maybe you didn't really need a top vent, and you didn't really check it, and they propolised it over. You may need to check. And I have a picture coming up of when I noticed it. It was when when they start to brood up, and it's after the winter solstice. shortest day of the year. Don't ask me how the bees know. It's always raining, but I guess it's like they can figure out where the sun is on a totally clouded over raining day. They can somehow sense that the days are getting longer once they pass the solstice, and they will start raising the queen's eggs. A lot of your feeders, there's a ladder, a mesh, you put some straw sticks in to prevent the bees from drowning. Make sure they can always climb out. Look at your feeders. Although bees have been known to fill your feeders with dead bees once the feeder's empty, and people say, oh, they drowned. Well, not necessarily. Sometimes they just have to push the dead bees out of the hive, and they aren't going out because it's too darn cold. So they will put dead bees up on your inner cover, and they will also push them into like an empty feeder if you had a frame feeder that you had to leave in there, which is a consideration. If it gets too cold, you may not want to open your hive up, pull your frame feeder out, and put frames in. You may just have to leave it in for the winter and then clean it out in the spring. And robbing risk. And your decisions may be different than commercial. Commercial's going to go for cost, including labor costs. So if you hear something that conflicts with everything I've already said, I just ask you to think about that. Pollen patties. Everyone I've ever seen make pollen patties makes them too thick and too dry. You want it ooey, gooey, goopy. And you make it with like 2 to 1. Forget those recipes. I just mix the powder with 2 to 1 syrup. And because sugar is hygroscopic, that'll keep it goopy. You make it peanut butter consistency, and you've got all that sugar in there, it pulls moisture in. That's hygroscopic. Don't you love those big words? We beekeepers need big words. Now we get into clusters. How am I doing on time? Am I talking too long without a break? Well, for me, not bad. Everybody awake still? Okay, good. And if you really do have a question, you can stop me. I'm on a roll, but I can be stopped. Winterization. Now we're going to talk about the cluster. That was the feed, and now we sort of shift focus to the cluster. You want a cluster that's large enough that can form and then actually probably break apart and reform depending on the weather changes outside, and be able to move, especially if it needs to move a little side to follow the stores and upward. And that's why we say brood to the bottom, stores to the top. Bees tend to move upward, and the heat moves up, so it's sort of natural for them to move upward. On a top bar, you don't have this system. So I put a picture of a top bar here so I would remember to say, they have to move, but they need to move in one direction. There are a lot of top bar hives out there that are made with a center entrance, and I don't understand that, because all the theory that I've read on top bars, everything I've seen, they have to move when it's really cold. They need to be able to move as the brood hatches into where there's partial brood mixed with the honey, into the honeycomb pollen stores. If the middle entrance makes them, if the beekeeper's encouraging them to put the brood in the center and the honey to 2 sides, what happens if there's a sudden freeze and the brood's hatched out, they move to one side, sudden drop in temperature, and they can't get to the other side easily. A cluster has to break apart to move. If you have a drop in temperature, it may get stuck on that side. Winterization, we're going to worry about wind and rain protection, and we're going to prevent condensation. A wet bee is a dead bee. That sounds to me like one of those samplers I used to make you embroider when you were a little kid and you're learning how to sew. And you embroider this slogan, frame it, and put it up on the wall. And access to the feeder, too. You need to be able to get to the feeder, and they need to be able to get to the feeder. Large enough. And actually, very small colonies can successfully overwinter. However, it would be nice to have the bigger one for more insurance. So, merge colonies if you have any doubts. Healthy ones. You can pick the queen. Now, if you're merging 2 colonies and each has a queen, you can pinch one, euthanasia. You can put one in a small reserve nuke and put it over to the side and save her until you see that the other one's doing really well and is accepted. I don't know why. Nobody knows why, but bees do their own thing sometimes. And they might reject one queen. But if you do a proper newspaper merge, it usually works. I've never seen it not work. Or you can just say, I can't do this. I can't pinch one. I don't want to put one over to the side. I'll probably have to kill her anyway. So let them duke it out. May the best queen win. You just put them together with the newspaper between the two hive bodies. The strongest colony, that's usually the colony with the most brood, is on the bottom. And then there's going to be some brood up in that other colony too. The newspaper in between, picture coming up on the next slide, I think. After 2 weeks, recheck, let them get settled in together, and then shift the frame so that you're still brood to the bottom, stores to the top. This was a sloppy merge that I did. I think it had to do with how I was lifted. I think I also knew that I was going to go back into this hive. It was an early enough merge. I didn't worry too much about the fact that this is obviously the bigger, stronger hive. I just went ahead and put it on. I also wanted that screen bottom board, I think. So I sort of ignored the rule, but I did the newspaper here. And here's the diagram in the Beekeeper's Handbook, one of my favorite sources. And you'll often see black and white diagrams that after a while you start to recognize they're out of the Beekeeper's Handbook, and we should all give credit and push sales of that because those are nice people, Samatero and Avitabu. So there's the explanation of how you do it. It's probably in your notes if you took beginner. Strong colony, newspaper. You can cut the slits if you want to. Oily paper towels. I've never done that. I don't know why you would do an oily paper towel. Maybe they might be some kind of theory that if they get a little oil on themselves, they can't smell each other, you know, because they're so busy cleaning off the oil. I don't know. And then the weak colony. A split, maybe a queenless colony. Good way to combine the queenless colony. There's some other ways, but this one is kind of the easiest way. I often, if I'm doing this, I often put a feeder up here because I figure this one's going to be fat and happy, not be perceived as robbing this one. But that's something I do. I don't know if everybody does that. We'll talk about that in Apprentice, see if anybody else, what other people think. So your cluster's large enough. Now you need it to be able to form. Well, why would that be a problem? Well, queen excluder. Don't leave the queen excluder in. She can't get through it. Drones, if there's any left, can't get through it. This is going to be difficult for the cluster to form, and as the cluster moves upward, the queen will get left behind. And sorry, there's no loyalty there. It's her problem if she can't cross the excluder, the whole colony moves upward. They can't figure it out. They will just desert her and go up. You will have excess boxes and frames by September. The top bar you're going to adjust with the follower board, which slides sideways. And you could just move frames that are empty to the side. Why to the side of the follower board? The empty side of the hive. Why do you have excess frames and boxes? Why are your bees rattling around in late September or even early September if you don't have knotweed coming in? Why do you have excess frames? Well, I always recommend over supering. If you're in doubt, Wall Street test, do they need another box or not? I don't know. As a beginning beekeeper, just put it on. Every time you see a frame of capped brood, make sure that there are 2 frames that are essentially empty. The bee that was in that cell before it chewed its way through the wax capping and came out, that bee that was emerging, worker bee, comes out and then lays down. When it is in the hive, it no longer takes up 1 cell. Its body covers a good 2, if not 3. So you should always, when you see lots of capped brood, make sure there's empty frames. So this results sometimes in you putting in frames that are not necessary, but it is a swarm control early in the year. Through the blackberry flow, I would say. There's also the queens that chimney. The queens that no matter what you do will never use those outside frames. They only use the middle 8 out of 10. You're lucky if they don't use 6 out of 10. They're just queens that do this. Or you have an 8 frame and they don't like them. They're cold. We have thin-walled hives, and the workers of the queen are real finicky, and they won't use those outside frames. You're going to need to take that out to get your stores and your bees together, well insulated and in a nice 3D arrangement. You may be taking off your empty honey supers. So that's actually going to be boxes coming off. And way back in the height of the nectar flow, all your, even your brood nest frames were covered with that shiny nectar. But every 2 frames of nectar dehydrated and ripened down to only a frame of honey if they didn't eat it. So suddenly you have those extra frames. Brood nest population fell, so not all those brood frames, once they finally got the honey out of them, actually have brood in them. And hopefully you got that population decrease in that lovely blue-yellow graph there. And I put this whole thing in. What I really put this in was just for this bottom part here. You just start with your 2 deeps or 3 westerns in the spring, and you do these various manipulations. Maybe you reverse, maybe there's, you know, it's pretty empty here. You reverse, but you put the first honey super on, and then you put the second one on, and then quite often you're too busy to go down here and do any rearrangements. And maybe she moves some of the brood up or something, and you put another one on. You can end up with a lot of boxes. And that is a valid method of beekeeping. It works. But you may have a lot of empty frames down here. And by the fall, you want to be going into winter, basically the same size hive that you're going to have in the spring. Now, you're enabling that cluster to move up. So you've taken out all this excess stuff, put the brood to the bottom, source to the top. You're also going to need to figure out how you're going to put things in. And this puzzled people. This is the order in which what your hive will look like. Okay, it doesn't really have a weight on top like a cinder block, but you got a strap on this hive. Then maybe there's some top insulation there. If you were going to use, here's a shim or spacer or rim, whatever you'd like to call it, with a burlap sheet stapled on the underside. I use a lot of 1/8 inch hardware cloth. Or window screen I don't use because it's useful to have that 1/8 inch hardware cloth there for other reasons. There's times when it can come handy when you're moving a hive or something, that it not be window screen, that it be 1/8 inch. Bees will sometimes cluster against a moving screen, and if it is window screen, they can actually suffocate everybody behind them. Their bodies actually cover the screen, whereas 1/8 inch, there's some airflow that goes through. I don't know if that makes sense, but I recommend doing the 1/8 inch hardware cloth instead of the window screening that you might naturally say, well, I've got that around. So this is the order. Weight, straps, you're insulating, your top insulation. Maybe you've got a moisture shim. Some people like a vent in that. And then they've got their feeder shim, candy board. Unless they put the feed right on the frames, it's above the inner cover or right below the inner cover. Below the inner cover is a little more accessible. Dry feed, like I said, they have to be able to move and leave the cluster to come up and get the dry food. So sometimes people, that's why they show you pictures of putting it right on the frames. The pollen sub, they often can't get to it if it's on, again, breaking. I'm thinking after Christmas especially. You know they're going to brood up no matter what you do, so you might as well let them have some pollens. It's my thinking. So that needs to be right on top of the inner cover, or better yet, right under it. And you have 2 deeps or 3 westerns for your basic hive, unless you're going to do, I don't recommend doing single deeps or 2 westerns the first year. You want to try that strategy the second year, great. You'll have the experience, you can think about it, think about your location. Then your mouse guard, or entrance reducer, and a screened bottom board. I still love a screened bottom board because when I pull the slide out, I can see what they're doing. I can see if they're eating the pollen patty all the way and just nibbling the wrapping and dropping that to the bottom. In the spring, when they uncap the honey, they drop the cappings onto that board, and I can see that they're uncapping honey. I can see, you know, mites, of course. I can see if anything looks wrong or anything looks right by using that white slide out. Some more about the cluster. Oh, that's where I intended to actually use that fall management. As I said, I just barely finished this presentation. The cluster. Back to the cluster. It contracts and expands with temperature. When the bee's body is reaching 50 7, it wants to hug. They are cold-blooded. They generate some heat, but all cold-blooded animals do. Remember, they're going to follow the heat up inside the hive. If it gets really cold, they have to be in contact with the stores to use them. And if they're moving as a cluster, that's why you want to start with the brood on the bottom so they form down there. The temperature, air temperature inside of the hive is basically the outside temperature. That seems really that seems counterintuitive, but I've got some diagrams coming up if it helps you understand it. And I'm trying not to just be a beginner level, but to help people who are so sick of hearing this, because here I am preaching again. Got to treat for varroa, you got to feed. Okay, I got to put something new in. The lowest survival temperature, and it can be incredibly low. There are bees that are kept at the Arctic Circle. It depends on the number of bees, the quantity of the stores, the duration of the cold, and I didn't put staying dry, but that's the other one. And bees have this incredible strategy. For a tropical insect to do this is incredible. And this is how they do it. And adenine methyl-melathopos, I cut and pasted that, so I spelled it correctly. Thank you. He speaks at Oregon State University, and he speaks up in Canada too. This is actually from a Canadian paper. I put the title there. And gorgeous diagrams. This right here, this is, there is a core. And if there's brood, even in January, if there's brood, it still has to be kept. You got everything in centigrade to drive you nuts. But about 93 degrees is about as low as it can go and develop. They have to, and remember, we're 98.6 inside our bodies. They have to keep any brood. The queen, about 70 degrees for her to be healthy, because she really can't move much, and they've got to feed her and keep her. They've got to keep her at least like about 70. So this is in centigrade, so I did put a table over here if it helps at all. Partly I put the table because here's where cluster formation happens. Cluster formation is happening. They are breaking up and coming back together right here between 10 degrees. I'm going to move this down. 10 degrees and 20 degrees. Okay, so looking at this, between 10 degrees and 20 degrees. So 50 degrees Fahrenheit and, let's do this again, 68 degrees. So out here, ambient temperature, which might be a little higher than outside, that's where they're forming. And this can happen pretty easily in our climate. I think this can happen very easily inside the hive. I think they do this. I think it complicates all of our calculating stores. Mine, I usually end up leaving more than they need. So I thought these diagrams were really interesting, and I could put them on the page if anyone thinks they're useful. But the temperature, oddly enough, when ambient fluctuates wildly, this is still centigrade. They love Celsius, you know, up there in Canada. And yeah, they were doing it to us from Virginia. We gotta have some decency here. But the way that the cluster doesn't break up as much as you would think with the ambient temperature making big changes. Actually, okay, there we go. Julian date. Oh, they're really funny. Okay, Julian date. I just realized what that is. Starting with the 1st of January is number 1 on the Julian date. Okay. Learn something new every day. Condensation. You either avoid it or you absorb it. In the avoidance tactics, condensation is the drippy part. So we're not talking about the moisture necessarily directly. We're talking about, let's not let it drip on the bees. So tilting the hive, raising the back, shoving a piece of 1x2 under the back to tilt it up. Some people leave this year round. It won't cause burr comb problems because this isn't a problem for the bees. If you were to raise the side of the hive, either side an inch, you could end up with burr, bridge, brace comb. The bees could do something funky because they're gravity oriented. But because you're lifting the back and the way the combs are parallel, at least the way we do it in the United States, this is called, I think, the cold way. There are a few beekeepers, I think it's Europe, where they turn the frames inside the hive at 90 degrees. And I think that's called the warm way. What it does is it blocks the cold air that could be coming in the entrance. So there actually is a set of beekeepers who do that. It's rare though in the United States. I've seen it discussed, but I don't know anybody who says that publicly that they do it. Anyone's come out of the beehive and told that that's what they do, is turn their frames 90 degrees. So we keep ours the cold way, I think is what it's called. So when you raise the back, it's not a problem causing bird comb. It doesn't interfere with the bee space because you don't have the frames swinging into each other. Or into the side of the hive would be really where they would end up touching. Insulating under the outer cover. If you insulate and the warm air rises inside the hive, you don't get condensation right above the bees, right under the outer cover. If you insulate fully, that cuts down how many surfaces in the beehive are cold. So it might be the floor where water condenses. If you want to adjust the condensation and humidity inside the hive, you can adjust it by sliding the sticky board in and out. Another reason I love those screen bottom boards with the slide out. And monitor the brood activity, because I've got a picture coming up where I went, ooh, I didn't need upper ventilation until now. It was January, and I needed it. To absorb, the moisture shim or quilt box, as people will call it, it could have anything in it. They used to actually use a lot of wool, and if you buy certain top bar sets, they use wool blankets on top of the top bar wedges, which are already very insulating because no air passes through that top bar, the wedges on the top bar. If you can visualize that on the top bar hives. That moisture shim will go above the dry feed. Again, if you need help in visualizing what we're trying to do, we're trying to not have a cold surface up here at the top. Okay, warm air is rising, red arrows for warm. And then there's cold, okay, it hits cold. Okay, if I put an inch or two of styrofoam here, that will keep this from ever being the temperature drop. Even if it does happen, you've got an inner cover here and the water should drip onto your inner cover. That's one of the two reasons for having an inner cover. The other one is so you can get the outer cover off so the bees haven't propolisted down completely. But this is the other reason for having inner covers, is so that when there is a drip, it's going to hit that inner cover and not go straight onto the bees, hopefully. Only if it goes through the hole in the center. So that's sort of being able to see fresh air coming in and how it would work. And then over here, where would you're hoping to start your brood at the bottom, stores up above, then your winter feed, the dry feed after they finished up their honey, okay, and hopefully it's warming up in the spring and they can get to it and they've moved up anyway. And then your wood chips or I use shredded newspaper works, and then maybe some solid insulation. Oh, don't forget your mouse-proof entrance reducer, which goes on before it freezes because mice like to find their nest before it freezes, and you can end up shutting the mouse in. Protection from the weather. If you need to move your hives, and there are a lot of people that are finding it's just easier to move the hive than to worry about wrapping, straw bales, they just put it under a carport. Not enclosed. Make sure your entrances are clear. If you try this. Not inside an enclosed warehouse or shed unless you are a commercial beekeeper, and this may look crazy, but it works, and they increase the CO2 to lower, I think, the respiration rate, cut down brood raising, get a brood break, which helps with controlling varroa so that it's lower. The varroa mite load is lower on the hive in the spring. They also wrap up, this is the Canadian beekeeper, so this is 4 hives, I think, wrapped up, and boy, they put a piece of bent, it explains what it is, piece of plywood, okay, bent. But you got to be careful. You got to know what you're doing, have a plan. If you decide to do wrapping, talk about it and think about it. Wrapping's a little bit tricky because you can convince a hive that it's really not winter yet. So I recommend that I'm going to talk about 3 stages to winterizing and make the wrapping further in, not at the beginning. Top insulation first, maybe. We'll talk about stage 1, 2, 3. Overwintering nukes is something that is really gaining a lot of attention because you can store extra queens. Obviously, if it's a smaller colony, they won't die of the cold if, in this case, they are going to need insulation. Here's some pieces of styrofoam, and then they wrapped it with tar paper. They made sure, weighing it, that they had it packed with the honey. I'm sure these are 5-frame nukes. They really look like 5-frame nukes. And this is a strategy a lot of people are doing to overwinter extra queens. If it sounds crazy to do this, they used to call this cellar wintering in root cellars, and it was done. This is a 1918 map of the United States where it would be profitable to do it. Zone 1, if you can find the little 1 there, it's profitable, and Zone 2, they're saying just do it. And of course, you're getting into that continental Arctic North winters, closer there. And the Agricultural Extension, WSU, Washington State University, is actually looking into going back to this somewhat, partly because it controls the varroa mite load by controlling the brood raising. You can get that brood break, and less stores are used. They're looking at it in old apple warehouses. So you can look this up on the WSU Agricultural Extension site. Interesting. Okay, you're avoiding or you're absorbing. Here's my January. Yay, look at all that wet water spot there. I knew they were getting more active, so I knew that I could put, it's still cold enough I didn't want to mess with them. So I put the granulated sugar right next to the hole in the inner cover. Here I put the pollen patty right on top of the inner cover, and look at all that moisture coming up, just venting right up. I think I put popsicle sticks all the way around. I don't think this inner cover had a notch, and I had styrofoam up here, and I didn't have a moisture absorbency because I usually don't need it. I sometimes put it in, but you have to watch. If you don't have something in there to absorb moisture, you need to be watching, especially when they ramp up for the brood rearing or the weather changes. I recommend that if you're going to look at top bar hive insulation and moisture absorbency and such, look at the Valkyrie Hive website. That's a Langstroth Long, the Langstroth Long Deep hive system. And I thought she had some interesting ideas on how to handle that. So do your winterization in 3 stages. If you were to, as soon as it got a little bit cold at nights, got down to the first nights it gets down to the 40s, and you slap all the wrapping on and the top insulation and you do everything at once, I think it could backfire on you. And I read this, and a couple of other people thought this too. So this is my theory. Before the temperatures drop, you pulled out all those excess frames and boxes. Change to a telescoping lid or a peaked roof, not a migratory. A migratory is flat. And this kind of roof, this is it looks like a dishpan to me, and it's the type of lid that is being sold now. Snohomish Bee Company is doing it. This is just a piece of metal. It's sort of telescoping, but not what we generally mean by telescoping. It allows, if it sits absolutely flat on top of your top hive body, it wouldn't let air flow in, but it's all metal. There's no natural insulation in this, not even your normal wooden type. So watch out. If you get this, I assume that it's intended to be used with insulation right underneath it. That's all I can figure. Okay, and I do top insulation. You can even leave the top insulation on year round. It's like the tilting 1 inch by raising the back 1 inch, tilting it. Some people do it year round. They say, I got too much to think about already. I'm just leaving it that way. The only thing that might affect some of your liquid feeders, if you were always tilted. Straps, weighted or weight the lid down. That might be a really good idea. You never know what's going to happen between freak windstorms or animals that get a little too curious. Honey is insulation too, don't forget that. This is stage 1. You're thinking about doing this stuff. You're not wrapping yet, but you got to get that mouse guard on before it freezes. And then this is going to be your last stage. This is what you're going to be taking off or changing late in the spring. And people had a hard time understanding this when I talked about it, and I can't do anything in person. This is so frustrating on Zoom. So this is what I stack up. This is what I'm stacking. So I prefer a screen bottom board, but I didn't have one to spare, except for this homemade one where they cut it out. But if I did have it, I'd do that with the slide out on the bottom. Mouse guard, unless you're sure you can do your wooden. And if so, you can do your wooden entrance reducer. Your 3 westerns on top or 2 deeps. Here's my inner cover, okay? So I did it like that. Bottom board, slide out, 3 westerns or 2 deeps, whatever you're using. Then on top is your inner cover. If you're using jar feeders, they go right on top. And then on top of that, you need a support to enclose those jars. So that went here. And then I put a moisture shim because it's a good idea. I mean, and it's very absorbing. Mine was shredded paper. A lot of things work, wood chips or whatever. And then this my styrofoam sheets. Another, you call it a shim or a spacer or a rim up on top. And especially if you have that metal thing, you better, that metal funny lid, they're calling a lid now, you would really want to have something insulated because metal conducts both ways. Heat out of the hive. And that's a true telescoping lid that when it's flipped over, the sides come down around. Then I would add a strap because this is getting pretty tippy by the time I do these separate little parts here. There's different ways you could do this. This would end up tippy enough, I would put the cam lock. Here's a cam lock strap on my wrapping. I use Reflectix later on for wrapping. But stage 1, we're just getting up to here, maybe this part on. Not wrapping yet. It gets to freezing at night. So that's sort of how I think of it. If you haven't raised the back of the hive yet, do it for sure. Maybe you didn't do it because your liquid feeders were on. I put the night count board in until I see a moisture problem. Liquid feed, not feed. Liquid feed is coming out because you're freezing at night. You drop definitely. They're not taking it anymore. You're probably dropping below the 50, 55 a day. You're putting on your dry feed shim, which is it'll be right below your inner cover, right above. So you're going to do it quickly so you don't chill anything. Then your moisture box, your quilt box. You're switching over to that dry feed pollen sub, which would have to be pretty much right on the frames if you're going to be giving any more of that. And maybe you've got a small top vent so that you can control the moisture at the top, especially if you see a big wet spot like I saw. And there is a strategy for no top vent. Talk to me about it or somebody before you do it. I have successfully done it until you get to January. And then the brood rearing stepped up and didn't work so well. That's when I went ahead and opened up a small top vent. But there are people who never top vent. And there are parts of the country where they never top vent. And I guess like Southern California, places that are lower humidity, they can do it and just do the tilt, the moisture absorbency, da-da-da, and they don't drown their bees. Stage 3 is a full wrap. You've got your entrance reduced down as far as you can, and everything else is on. And then you're going to reverse. You're going to work backward in the spring. You're going to take the wrap off. You're going to open up the entrance some. You're going to switch from the dry feed to the liquid feed. You're going to reverse these 3 stages. Now you just have to monitor for the winter. And remove the dead from the bottom board. Make sure that you can check your slide out board. Just make sure that the bees can get out, preferably both entrances, top and bottom. Make your notes and store your equipment, store your honey, freeze for wax moth. Wax moth, yeah. I have to put a note about wax moth. The bug zapper did seem to help this year. I put a bug zapper on a timer, so it came on for like an hour or 2 in the evening when there couldn't be any bees flying, and it's winter too. And the open air and circulation just doesn't work well enough unless you can get it right up against a window. And I tilted that hive body right up by a window. It's just too dark in my sheds. I only have small. And the wax moths don't like the light. They don't like the air circulation. And I assume they get zapped by the bug zapper because it did seem to help. The other options are chemical, like PDB, the paradichorobenzene, or paramoth. I think it's sold at a Paramoth, not the mothballs. Not, mothballs are naphthalene. Naphthalene's toxic to everything, which is why they sell. But paradichlorobenzene, if it would be toxic to bees, but it airs out of the wax better, almost completely, whereas the naphthalene can't air out. I'm thinking acetic acid might work. I got to look that up. Acetic acid is used for, I think, nosema as well, and I was going to look that up. The British beekeepers tend to do more work with fumigating and also cleaning and sanitizing frames, which is something I want to explore in an apprentice. It's not highly recommended that you try to sanitize anything with bleach or lye or acetic acid. Yeah, those are the three I can think of. Okay, so you're down to seeing if everything survives, if you did everything right. You get horrible dead outs, take these horrible pictures, an autopsy. I highly recommend, and there are people who something goes wrong, top blows off, gets knocked over. I highly recommend that you not just straighten it up and leave it there to be robbed out, to have the ants move in or the mice move in. Actually would remove and store. You don't want to lose your wax because 5 to 10 pounds of energy of honey to make a pound of wax. And a pound of wax goes pretty far, but it's a resource that you have next spring. Any honey or pollen that's good. If you can get it into your freezer, unless you can, sometimes it's late enough in the spring. I did one time have a dead out, and I just looked at that much honey and said, this one's going to need some feed. And I just, on the warmest day I could get, quickly put a super of honey right on top of another hive and had that benefit of that in the spring. But do something. Don't say, oh, they'll rob it out. That's true, but it might be your neighbor's bees bringing in diseases. It might be the yellow jackets that get attracted and notice that there's brood here. They can rob later. There's a bee journal. I promote that ridiculously. So in the basic summary, we start now because we can't trust our Pacific Northwest weather. It's just too variable. If you procrastinate on ordering your supplies and making your plan, something will go wrong. And life is busy. You're working full time, you may have 5 days of the week, you can't go out anyway, and that will be the sunny weather you could have gone out. It rains on the weekends, right? That's the way it works in the Pacific Northwest. Try to take your losses now on weak hives. Combine them, let them die. Don't try to, it's a waste of energy for you. It really is. If there's any way you can merge them, do it. If that's the only hive you've got, okay, insulate, wrap, do all this other stuff, and it's good experience, even if you lose them. The condensation, the dripping on them, the starvation, those are all more dangerous than the cold. The mild temperatures are actually a problem, and our humidity are actually a problem. And more activity, when you see them, they're awful busy, you're in trouble because they're using up their stores faster. Remember to clear the entrances. Sounds really silly, but people forget those really long hive tools work. A bent clothes hanger works. The dryer lint brush works if you don't get caught borrowing it for your beehives. Got to remember to return it so you don't get caught. And do pick up or seal out your dead outs. Don't leave them out there. They're a resource. Why waste it? You've done all this work. Even if your hives don't survive, you still have wax. You have experience. You may have some honey.